Hello and welcome to Opwall's Field Notes, a podcast created by Operation Wallacea to share stories and insights from our 25 years working in the field. My name is Sophia Wood, Opwall's country manager for Ecuador and director of Friends of Wallacea, and I will be your host for this series. We launched this podcast to shine a light on the world of biodiversity field research and the work of those who dedicate their lives to understanding and protecting our planet. Each month, we have conversations with scientists, community conservationists, and experienced academics about new research, protecting biodiversity, and daily life out in the field. In this episode, I sit down with Toby Farman, Opwall's systems manager and Romania country manager, to discuss the unique ecosystems of the Transylvanian countryside that have helped protect European wildlife in this region. Toby originally studied biotechnology, but an Opwall trip in 2007 sparked his passion for travel. After graduating, Toby traveled the world for 2 years, a story he talks about in the episode, with nothing more than a backpack. Rather than settle down on his return, Toby has gone on to manage Opwall projects in Mozambique, South Africa, and now Transylvania. In this episode, Toby will discuss what makes Transylvania in particular so special for wildlife. We talk about how bears, hay meadows, and traditional agriculture fit together within the mosaic of hills and valleys that define the Transylvanian region, as well as what the rest of the world can learn from this very special place. Hi, Toby. Thanks so much for joining us today.
No problem at all, Sophia. It's my pleasure.
So since we're taping everything from home, where are you based right now?
So I'm at home in Lincoln. So I don't know if anybody knows, but Opwall's based in kind of the middle of the Lincolnshire countryside in quite an odd location. But the closest city to the office is Lincoln, which is where I live. So I'm in my home office at the moment.
And I presume you've been there for the last year.
Yeah, I mean, with COVID, it's Groundhog Day. So yeah, just working from home most days for the most part. Looking forward to getting back into the office, to be honest.
Yeah, same here. So you've obviously been working for Opwall for several years, but you had quite an interesting, career path before that. So how did you first become inspired and decide to become a scientist?
So I've been with Opwall for a good 10 years now. In fact, it'll be 11 years in September. And it's interesting because despite working for Opwall, I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a scientist because I definitely would kind of work more on the operations side. And the science in my background isn't necessarily kind of directly relevant with the work that we do in Opwall. And that's because I kind of had a very roundabout way of getting into Opwall and kind of post-degree and kind of doing everything else. But I've become a bit of a jack of all trades at Opwall, and with everything, there's a bit of overlap with the science side of things, but I'm definitely kind of more operational stuff. But it started back kind of like pre-university. I was originally on a path to start off with computer science, and almost at the last minute before I went to university, I decided that I didn't want to sit in front of a computer or sit in an office my entire life. So I kind of made a last minute change over to a biotechnology degree, which you could probably understand is why my science background doesn't necessarily have the biggest overlap with Opwall. But I went to Nottingham University, and it was based on the same campus as a bunch of environmental scientists, and I was quite friends with quite a few of them. And during my second year, one of them handed me an Opwall brochure. And I'd never really done anything like that at all, so I was quite attracted with the idea to do it, and I signed up for a 6-week project in Egypt back when Egypt was still running. And it kind of completely shifted my perspective and kind of what I wanted to do, because I always, with the biotech degree, I'd set the goal of maybe I'd go into research or something like that, or kind of lab-based research directly after university. And I think I was probably on a path to kind of like finish my degree and then go straight onto a PhD and then be stuck in a lab my entire life. But much like I decided I didn't want to be stuck in an office my entire life, I decided I didn't want to be stuck in a lab my entire life. So I graduated from uni, and purely on the basis of the fact that I did Opwall and it was exciting, and I'd never really kind of done that before, I decided to go off and traveled quite a lot. So I spent a couple of years backpacking and kind of exploring the world a little bit, and then got back home and decided to start looking for companies to work for. And at the top of my list was Opwall, because they'd kind of set me down this path initially. So, and weirdly enough, I grew up in Lincolnshire, and for those of you in England that know the UK, Lincolnshire is it's the middle of nowhere. It's like it's got the second lowest population density in the UK or something like that.
Right.
And to find that the Opwall office was like 15 minutes from where my parents grew up was a bit weird. So I ended up applying, and it was 10 years ago, 11 years ago now.
It was fate.
It was fate. I think it was fate as well. So it's I never really intended to go down this path, but I think I'm so grateful and thankful for the person that handed me the Opwall brochure during my second year of uni, because it's basically that was the defining moment of my life, and certainly over the last kind of 12, 13 years, and potentially many more as well. So a bit long answer to a short question, I'm sorry, but it's a bit of a roundabout
you
way.
answered about 5 of my questions in one, but I want to take a step back to talk about you traveling the world, because you humbly described it as just going for a trip around the world for a while, but actually, obviously, you traveled around the world for 2 years. Sounds like some of that was inspired by Opwall. What did you learn during that trip? That's a pretty unique experience. And is it something that you would suggest for others who want to discover more about themselves and the world before kind of settling into a career?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And if anybody has the possibility of doing that kind of thing, I'd highly recommend it. So I spent, just to kind of give you the quick version of it, I spent a couple of years on the road. I basically worked a fair amount of time for about 6 months or so before I left, and then jumped on a flight to Moscow and did the Trans-Siberian, and then went to Asia and Australia and a few other places and stuff like that. And it was an eye-opening experience. Probably, I mean, you asked kind of the biggest thing that I learned, and probably the biggest thing that I learned is actually probably something which helps with Opwall as well, which is if something is going wrong, that's not necessarily going to work out badly. So miss a bus and end up staying somewhere exciting for a while, lesson. And you can't necessarily get to a place, or maybe you have to stay somewhere for a little bit longer, or basically I kind of learned more than anything else to be able to take everything in my stride, regardless of what was happening, up or downs. And I think that kind of that set me up in the right mentality for working for Opwall, and being able to think on your feet and respond to things in time and stuff like that. So it's an interesting one. I mean, I would say everybody needs to kind of get out of their home and kind of explore as much as they can before they lose the ability to do that. So for me, it was post university, and I did bits, and thinking back, I did bits like volunteerism projects that I regret doing and stuff like that. But it was still an eye-opening experience for me, and I think I came out as a stronger person, and I think most people would do. Travel appeals to the human spirit quite a lot, and I can't rate it highly enough to anybody. So,
well, you've managed to make travel and tourism a big part of the rest of your career, obviously, as well, working with Opwall for the last 10 years. And you mentioned that you were able to get a job at Opwall after coming back from this trip, and it was right down the street from your house, which is amazing because, as you said, Lincolnshire is in the middle of nowhere in the UK. And you went on then to manage the South Africa site for several years before becoming our Transylvania country manager. So I don't want to go into too much detail on South Africa, since we'll cover it on another podcast, but how big of a change was it to go from South Africa to Romania?
I mean, it's a huge change. I mean, as you could probably imagine, purely from from the environment you're working in, it's completely different. I don't have to worry about elephants or anything like that working in Romania, and it's so even in the back end. So how the projects are set up and how the projects are work with local partners and things like that. They're two completely different projects. And when I started out, when I first moved from South Africa to Romania, I had that. I had the thought, well, I'm going to miss my elephants. What am I going to see in Romania? But if you asked me to pick now between the two of them, what would be my favorite, I would struggle to do so, because the second I hit the ground in Romania, I just completely fell in love with it, fell in love with the work that we do there, fell in love with the people that are involved with the project. But having said that, I do miss seeing elephants every now and again.
Well, so, now that you are in our Romanian site in the Transylvanian countryside, could you tell us a little bit more about the site and what the main research questions are there?
Yeah, so the project's based in. We kind of interchangeably use the terms Romania and Transylvania a little bit, and we're kind of very guilty about that across the website and many other places as well. But we work in the Transylvanian region of Romania, in a region called the Târnava Mare within Transylvania, and to kind of understand the work, you kind of have to consider Romania as an entity as a country and how it's developed over the last kind of 10, 15, 20 years, because it's a country that has a lot of interesting history behind it, a lot of societal shifts, a lot of historical troubles, going back so far as from the 1900s on to the modern day. There's quite a large amount of historical and cultural flux in it, particularly because of kind of the Soviet era. But kind of the long and the short of it, without getting into too much history, is you get. It's basically the Transylvania region, which was inherited by the Saxon people, which are people of Germanic descent, despite the fact that they're a long way from the Germanic regions. They traditionally existed within Transylvania, and they, because of what culturally and historically happened over the last century or so, never really developed Transylvania in line with the rest of Europe. It was an area which was typically impoverished. It was an area which didn't really historically grow. It never went through the agricultural revolution to the extent that that everywhere else did. And so back in the early 90s, it was an area which was massively underdeveloped, certainly in comparison to Europe, but even within Romania itself. It's like stepping back in time, which is the phrase we regularly use for it, but it really has so much truth to it. And in the early 90s, the Saxon peoples, after kind of the Soviet bloc fell and all the rest of it, the Saxon people basically got the opportunity to return to Germany, which means that the majority of the population of Transylvania upped and left, and then it was then the Romanian population slowly kind of filtered back into it. But that kind of brings us up to more modern times, in that you've got an area of Romania which is very underdeveloped compared to everywhere else. Even within Romania, let alone within Europe. It's still an area where horses and carts are a common sight. It's an area without much pesticide use. It's an area without much herbicide use. It's an area with very basic levels of farming, a lot of subsistence farming. And I mean, like I said, it's like stepping back in time. But things are changing. Romania's modernizing. They became an EU member. There's plenty of money kind of coming into the area, which means that the traditional farming methods which have been in place, I mean, we're talking since the 12th century. This is what I mean when I say going back in time. It's the farming methods that have been used for thousands of years, well, 8,000 years. But that is now swiftly being replaced by more modern farming methods. So tractors, herbicides, insecticides, blah, which is great for the actual populace. It's great for the people on the ground. It means that farming is becoming more efficient, and we are humans, which means we like more efficient farming. We like cheaper food for understandable reasons. But the flip of that coin is the fact that because Transylvania never really hit that industrialized agriculture revolution that everywhere else did, it was one of the last few remnants of a kind of a mosaic of habitats which used to spread across the entirety of Europe. Over 1,000 years of low intensity agriculture spread throughout Europe, throughout England, throughout everywhere else. There were species and populations of animals that kind of grew up alongside humanity. And then we got to the 1900s and decided to rip out all the hedgerows and drain all the marshes and, remove wolves and bears and basically turn everything into one massive, great big monoculture crop. And Transylvania, because of its issues with cultural development and because of its history, never got to that, which means it's stunning in how ancient the landscape is. It's stunning in the fact that it was a landscape which is there has to be a human population there for it to exist, because it's a habitat that consists of species which almost rely on a certain amount of human influence. You remove the humans entirely from the situation, you're going to revert to forest, which is, fair enough. It's not a bad thing, but the diversity levels you get within that kind of low intensity farming area is something that you don't see anywhere else in Europe anymore. So because that's now under risk, because that's now under threat, because one of the last remnants of human history and human agricultural history is disappearing. That's where the project is kind of based around. So the last thing we want to do is kind of prevent the modernization of the area. But what you do want to do is prevent the modernization at the cost of the environment. So we work with a partner organization called Adept, and Adept are basically working with the local communities and the local populace to try and basically do things like swap out their income sources, allow them to do kind of to push them down a more sustainable agricultural route, to maintain the diversity of the area without costing the population, without forcing them to live in poverty. So it's an interesting fine line. We can't remove humans entirely. We need humans to retain low intensity. You don't want to cost them their livelihoods. So that's where we kind of fit into it. So we work with Adept, and our job's basically, we go in and we do this kind of rapid biodiversity assessment. We go across a bunch of different villages within Transylvania, have a look at the meadows, have a look at the diversity of all the different species in the area, and basically we can then use that to prove that this is why this area needs protecting. This is what's happening to the biodiversity here. And then from that, we can use it to gather funding for sustainable agriculture methods. We can use it to do a bunch of other stuff as well. So it's basically, it's the data that underpins why we want to protect the area.
That's fantastic, and such a great description of how Transylvania works and why it is the way it is, even within a country like Romania. So could you maybe dig a little bit deeper into exactly why these specific traditional agricultural methods have been so good for biodiversity? Like, why is Romania a place in Europe where you see species that you rarely or no longer see in the UK or other parts of Europe?
It comes back to diversity, breeding diversity, really. If you have a look at the direct comparisons between, sat in Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire is a big farming county within the UK. If I look beyond, if I go a mile away from my house, I will start hitting fields, and those fields are, dozens of acres wide. They've got no breaks in them. It's all single monoculture crop. Everything that's not that crop gets killed off very quickly, using a combination of usual herbicides and pesticides and all the rest of it. And that picture can be copied and pasted across the entirety of Europe, pretty much. We like big fields. Big fields are easy to farm with. We don't like diversity in our crop fields because it lowers yield. And then you take that out, and then you compare that to Romania. And Romania, the traditional agricultural methods there. For a start, you can get rid of the herbicides, the insecticides, and that kind of stuff, simply because the people can't afford it, let alone have the ability to kind of put it on crops. So you have a landscape which is kind of split into multiple different types. So rather than being just one big monoculture, the landscape's kind of cut into three different types. So you do get kind of arable crop fields out there, and you get meadows quite predominantly, and then you get forests. And it's changing now, but it usually kind of depends on how far away how far you are from the village, because usually you'll convert crop field, you'll make a crop field close to the village, because if you don't have a tractor to go out to it, then you're not gonna you're gonna try and keep it closer. Stuff like meadows tend to be a bit further, and then you tend to leave forest where it's where you can't get a plow, basically. So with the meadows and the crop fields, there is rotation, as there is in most places. The most defining thing of the area are the meadows. So that with the meadows, you have small populations that are not generally selling to market. You have subsistence agriculture. You do have a little bit of produce going to market, but there's not enough people there, and there's not enough for-profit farms, that a lot of the land gets left as meadow. And the meadows there are astonishing. And those meadows are, they're certainly not monoculture. You get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of flower species. You get hundreds which then in turn support hundreds and hundreds of different insect and butterfly species, which then in turn support hundreds and hundreds of different bird species. Now, when they take those meadows out, they will, clear an area, turn it into arable land, but you still get a certain amount left over, and it will revert to meadow within a couple of years if you leave it to go fallow as well. So the vast amount of meadows that's out there does retain that high level of diversity, and it's usually prevented from heading over to forest by the fact they graze animals on there. You graze cows, you graze sheep, you take what was the traditional way of doing things was every single household maybe had a couple of cows, a couple of sheep, or something like that. They would send them all out in a group to the meadows each day, which is awesome to see. I'm not going to go into the thing behind it, but those sheep and cows, they will keep the meadow as meadow, stop it from kind of foresting, and they will eat seeds and deposit those seeds everywhere else, as well as sheep and cows are wont to do. And that kind of combination of things helps keep helps it reverting to forest, which helps build the diversity needed for everything else as well.
That's extremely helpful to understand. Obviously, if you have miles and miles and miles and miles of one crop, it's very hard for lots of species to live on it. And obviously, I presume those wildflower meadows are very beautiful in the summer when people are visiting that region.
They're astonishing. I mean, it's the biggest identifier for, I think, a lot of people is just the number of butterfly species that people see, because you don't see that kind of thing anywhere really. Meadows don't exist in the UK really. I mean, other than in certain kind of areas set aside for conservation. But even the meadows in the UK, you don't get the diversity of flowers supporting the diversity of butterfly species. So it's astonishing to see it out there, especially when you consider that most of Europe and the UK was like that at one point as well.
Right. Well, another thing you mentioned earlier was, Europe starting to go towards monoculture and removing a lot of the large predators. So one of the things I think a lot of people are usually astonished by in Romania is the amount of bears that are there. So why is Romania such a safe haven for bears? And can you actually see bears?
I mean, again, it kind of comes back to history and the fact that, I mean, bears have existed in Romania since time immemorial, as bears existed through most of Europe since time immemorial. But the thing is that as humans, like I said, we like to take out forests, because if we take out forests, and that gives us farmlands, we like to destroy habitat to make it more useful for humanity, which is fine for humanity, but not necessarily great for their species. So for various kind of historical, political, societal, cultural reasons, some of them quite negative, at least as far as the human population goes. You had a great big expanse of forest, which was left not entirely alone, but certainly left enough to allow a bear population to maintain, not to survive or grow or anything else like that, but maintain. You also have other factors involved as well, like hunting is always one of those big kind of points that you get a lot of countries where they did have forests. They may have had hunts, or they may have gone out and removed the bear population due to their issues with human wildlife conflict, and there's so many reasons why bears have disappeared across the entirety of Europe, but most of those have applied in a smaller extent within Romania, even to the point of having Soviet officials designating forests within Romania as bear hunting grounds and things like that. But the long and the short of it is it's an area which has a large amount of forest which can still support a bear population, because humanity kept its hands off for various reasons, both good and bad.
And we see a lot of bears on camera traps there. I've seen lots of videos.
Yeah. The second half of that question, I should say. So we do see bears, and on the camera traps. They're one of the species that we do catch quite regularly. It's always exciting when you see bears as well on camera traps. Occasionally see them in person as well. Sadly, I have never, but a lot of that tends to be because I sit in camp running things while sending people out to go do more interesting things like see bears. But it's so bears are common-ish on camera traps and rarely seen in person as well. But it's always exciting when we do.
Fair enough. Well, so what lessons can Europe or other developed regions learn from Transylvania to help, improve their biodiversity or protect wildlife?
A lot of the lessons that you can take away from Transylvania are lessons that European countries are slowly starting to understand and implement more as well, just in the general. I mean, over the last few years, we have had a bit more of an uptick in kind of how environmentally responsible most countries are. But Romania takes that. I mean, this area of Romania takes it to kind of the extreme, but the ability to kind of maintain a mosaic of habitats and is not necessarily completely going to destroy a profit margin, I guess is the best way to put it. Because over the last kind of 150 years, everything has been profit driven. We've been, I say profit driven, more yield driven, but you can still get reasonable farming yields and you can still get, a decent livelihood, even if you use sustainable methods and so on. And that's coming to the fore within the areas we work in Romania, because that's what we're trying to push. We're trying to push the ability for farmers to be able to exist in a sustainable way without costing their income. So taking that and then transferring it elsewhere in Europe is something that's, is something that you can definitely learn from. But having said that, I mean, a lot of governments are pushing towards, restoring hedgerows and, and creating kind of like verges and things like that to help try and retain that mosaic, but or rebuild that mosaic, I guess I should say. But
well, hopefully Europe is heading in that direction. Obviously, we've seen many more efforts towards things like rewilding and going back to traditional agriculture over the last few years. So to go back a little bit to your experience, obviously working in numerous field sites around the world, what's your favorite part about working in the field, and what are some of the biggest challenges you've come across?
So I mean, I've spent quite a bit of time in the field, so there's a few kind of random kind of stories that spring to mind. But from my personal perspective, it's not even really kind of an in-field thing. It's more kind of an Opwall thing. So like I said, I mean, I have a bit of a science background, although not necessarily the most relatable one to it. But I've worked with, over the last 10 years, I mean, several thousand students have come through camps that I've run. And my favorite part of the trip is, I think, is probably a part of an expedition which most people dislike, which is feedback day. I love feedback day. I love sitting down with groups and finding how much I've opened that's very egotistical, how much the project has opened eyes to the reality of kind of diversity and biology and what life can be like, with certain things considered, and basically having people consider things that they never really considered before, and having that kind of that mental shift more towards an environmentalism focus or a biology focus, and just sitting down with groups and kind of basically chatting to them about that is something that I get a lot of enjoyment from. And you get some people that where feedback day is a day to be scared, but I love it because it's just because the ability to shift the minds of people on site towards the positive, or at least what I consider the positive, is something that I find really enjoyable. So that's less of a field thing and more of an Opwall specific thing. As far as field things go, I mean, there's a few things out there, but it's I think that's what I get the most enjoyment out of.
What about the challenges?
Oh, I mean, I don't think any field project in existence over the last, forever has ever gone exactly right. I think anybody that's ever done any field research will relate to the fact that nothing ever goes smoothly. So it's part and parcel of what you're doing. You get small issues, you get big issues, but nothing is ever insurmountable. It's easy to take for granted things like the basic nature of living conditions and the fact that some people might struggle with that. You also kind of take for granted that occasionally people might twist their ankles, a kilometer from from a road or that kind of thing, or it might rain when it's not supposed to, which means you have to kind of cancel surveys and stuff like that. Like there's plenty of kind of issues and challenges that will go into your average Opwall field season, but it's part of the adventure as well. I mean, like I said before, like when I was traveling, you just like it's if you get through something, it's a story, and you can generally walk out on the other side being positive about whatever's happened. So
yeah, I can hear from your voice the challenges are part of what draw you as well. So
I think I've said to people many times that I think the most boring season would be one that went perfectly. And so part and parcel of doing this kind of thing is the ability to kind of react. And a lot of these things, like there is so much opportunity in things maybe not necessarily going smoothly that it's not even funny. I mean, this is making, I mean, I'm making things sound like things go terribly all the time, where that couldn't be further from the truth.
No, of course.
But like it's Opwall expeditions are an adventure for a reason. So being able to embrace that is part of the fun. So
what's the coolest or craziest thing you've seen while working out in the field?
I mean, not to be honest. I mean, there's quite a few things out there. I mean, you got 10 years of field stories behind you, and it's like it's one of those things. Like seeing a pangolin for the first time in South Africa was insanely cool. Sitting with wild dogs in South Africa as well. Going out and seeing a wildcat in Romania, or seeing a glimpse of a wildcat in Romania, but then also kind of comparing that to the time I saw a wildcat in South Africa. It is a weird kind of there's quite a few random awesome things that I've seen. One of the things that actually springs to mind though is actually like it kind of goes back to wildcats, and it's less really something I saw but more kind of something that we kind of discovered. So we changed one of our camera trapping methods recently. I say recently, and like from 1 year to another. We basically used to set camera traps in kind of along game trails within Transylvania, with the idea that we were going to kind of catch stuff more often if we were putting them on game trails, but we wanted to make the science more robust. So we changed a couple of years ago to a grid-based system instead. And one of the things that we found was that we were getting so many more videos of wildcats than before, and it kind of comes down that the logical thing to think about is the fact that maybe they're actually avoiding game trails, so we're seeing them more often. And that's not something or anything like that, but it's kind of it could be as simple as maybe the wildcat population has gone up. I don't know, but kind of the jump in that and kind of having that realization that we're seeing so many more was quite exciting. So I found that particularly cool as well. Might not be the most interesting thing, but it's
nerdy cool.
It's nerdy cool. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I've seen bull elephants fighting and stuff like that. No. We'll talk about the wildcats on camera instead. That's it's
on brand. Well, yeah. So what advice do you have for people who are interested in starting a career in conservation or in ecology, or do you even have any advice for your younger self?
Yeah, it's find a passion. I think it's like we'll forget for my younger self for now, but we'll talk about kind of the advice I've got for everybody that wants to get into conservation is basically find something that you're passionate about. Don't go broad, go specific. The best, I've worked with a lot of people over the last 10 years, and the best people I've ever worked with are the people that are very enthusiastic about a weirdly small topic, that are so enthusiastic and so dedicated to one particular field that enthusiasm shines through them, and that is where they get their joy, which means that joy tends to transmit to everybody else. So if you're going into conservation, don't go into conservation, go into ornithology or herpetology, or find a field, find a specific, and even within those fields, find, if you're going to find a species that you're particularly interested in and focus down on that, and find a passion, basically find a specific passion and go from there. And I think go a long way. Yeah.
To end us out on a positive note, why do you personally believe we should keep fighting to protect biodiversity and prevent climate change? And really, what gets you out of bed in the morning?
That's a big question.
No wrong answers.
Yeah. It's a big question. It's a difficult one to answer. I mean, why do we fight for biodiversity? Why do we fight for our planet? Because we live here. Humanity has done some terrible things to the planet over the last, just over the last 100, 200 years. And I think it's something that we have to do as a species, is try and undo a lot of that damage. And that's a very simplistic kind of answer to it. But it's, rolling back the clock on the issue, on the mistakes that we've made over the last kind of 100, 200 years in order to ensure that we can continue to live on the planet that we call home is a big part of it to me. It's a very fluffy answer. I feel like I could be more specific than that. I'm not sure.
That's okay. It's just your personal answer. I mean, we all are working on the same, major mission here, I think. And we all have our reasons for playing our small role in this global challenge.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Toby, for telling us all about Transylvania and your work with Opwall. It was a joy to have you on the podcast, and have a great rest of your day.
No problem at all. Thank you for inviting me. Cheers.
Thank you for tuning in to Opwall's Field Notes. We hope you were inspired by Toby to travel around the world and maybe even visit Transylvania to see its bears, woodpeckers, and incredible biodiversity. Please do be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on new episodes about conservation and biodiversity hotspots around the world, coming soon on Opwall's Field Notes.